Everyone, thank you for joining me for our day texts. As many of you know, we tried to do a show earlier, but it got a little off the rails, so we reset for 8:30 around this time so that we could get back to the texts. We're starting our readings in Genesis, where we will go through the Hebrew and Greek translations that I've done to date and review the material to try to see what we can learn from it historically, consider various things that are described in terms of what we have learned today scientifically, and then also apply the historical information to our lives today to the extent that we can benefit from it, and so that we better understand our place in the world, where we came from, or just have an overall better understanding of biblical history. We will be considering a few well-known expressions and ideas today, like "in the beginning" and "what is time?" You know, often we think about time and what it is, and yet we use it all the time, right? It's not like we're ignorant of how we keep time and measure things. And that's pretty much what time amounts to. Our measurement of things as they occur in relation to each other based on our position on the Earth's rotation, axis, the sun and moon, and stars above, that we use to chart or measure the movement of ourselves, the planet, and everything in it and above it. And so in Genesis 1, we read about the things that were created, and they are described as the heavens and the earth. And so I only cited one text for today, and that is Genesis 1:1, because it relates to another famous text, John 1:1, at least in terms of the beginning, the opening words in the Greek text of John and the Greek translation of Genesis 1. But first, let's get to Genesis 1, Hebrew and Greek text. Then we'll read a note that I prepared. We'll talk a little bit about the parallel use of the opening expression in John and some other related texts. Okay, Genesis 1:1, according to the Hebrew and Greek texts, states, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." That's the Hebrew translation. In the Greek, it's pretty much the same. "In the beginning, God made heaven and earth." The reason I used "made" in the Greek translation versus "created" in the Hebrew translation, even though I see them as pretty much conveying the same idea, it's possible that the Greek word used, poieo, not the common word for creation, katizo, involves more of a forming together or making of things that were already produced to some extent, but not in their final form or shape. Like an analogy I gave previously involving a cake, right? You could make the cake batter from pre-existing ingredients that were made, and you make the cake batter, but you still haven't made the cake yet. It's only a cake when it's a cake. There are only the heavens and the earth when the heavens and the earth were made. But then, as we're going to see, more is done to them even, kind of like in the analogy I just gave with the cake batter and the cake. All right, so, and then in the Hebrew, it pretty much the term bara involves create. And so I conveyed a slightly different sense in the Greek text with made, just because the Greek verb poieo is different from katizo and may have a slightly different sense here. Also, the only other difference really is the use of the article and non-use. The Hebrew text uses the article, the, before heavens and earth, whereas in the Greek text it does not. So I don't really see a difference there, significant if any, just because the references themselves can stand uniquely on their own with or without the article, although there could also be a different sense and meaning. Still, I don't really see it in terms of a different sense or meaning, heavens and earth, but I wanted to make sure everyone at least had an idea of the difference in the text, the different verb, different use of the article. Okay, now I prepared a note to this text in my translation. I put it in the description below. So let's go ahead and take a look at that, and then we're going to read one text from Proverbs, talk a little bit more about the opening words of John 1:1, and how they relate to these texts. All right, so in the beginning, what is that? It says God created the heavens and the earth. So let's read the note first, and then we'll discuss what John has to say about it. The note that I put in the description and to these two texts states that with reference the reference in the two texts we read, Genesis 1:1, Greek and Hebrew, has to do with a period of time, in which certain events took place. In this case, the events which are from verse 1 through the rest of chapter 1, which are described as physical creations or transformations of physical creations, including the physical universe and the earth itself and all the things made in it. And then I state, in the beginning here does not expressly refer or relate to anything but the physical heavens and earth. This is true also for the similar expression, in Psalm 102:25, which is quoted in Hebrews 1:10, and which is translated from the Greek as, at the time of the beginning, you, Lord, position the earth, and the heavens are the workings of your hands. And from the Hebrew of Psalm 102, or 101 if you were using the Greek, during the first things you set the earth in place, and the heavens are the works of your hands. So here in Psalm 102, quoted in Hebrews 1, which in the Hebrew text refers to Jah, but the application in Hebrews 1 refers to Jesus, and I'm going to explain why. There's actually two reasons why it applies to him there, but my point here, and in our discussion about Genesis 1 primarily, is what is this beginning? Okay, we'll get to Jesus and his role in these things in a minute. But where are we, right? Time-wise, where are we when this happens? In the beginning. What beginning? Of all things, spiritual and non-visible and invisible, like Paul describes in Colossians 1? Well, in Genesis 1, it only describes the physical heavens and earth. The physical heavens as far as the planetary and celestial bodies, and then the different spacing between that heavens and the earth below, and the sky heavens, which we'll discuss further going through these day texts in Genesis. So the only things described in the context of Genesis 1, the whole chapter, are physical creations, heavens and earth, both of them. And then in Psalm 102 or 101, if in the Greek, sometimes the references are a little different, number-wise. But they both say basically the same thing, right? The Greek uses the same terms or similar terms as Genesis 1, at the beginning versus in the beginning. And it describes that at that time, the positioning of the earth and the heavens were done. That's exactly what's described in Genesis. And other things as well. But the earth and the heavens above and their placement is exactly what's described. So we have another reference in Psalm 102 saying the same thing that Genesis 1 goes on to describe. The physical creations, heavens, planetary, celestial, and spatial, space, atmospheric layers of the earth, and the spacing between are also considered. We'll get to that in later texts. But again, we're talking physical. Then, the rest of the note, I state, compare the use of from the beginning of creation. That's a quote from 2 Peter 3:4, which clearly involves the time, and only the time, when God made humankind. Because it's describing the creation of humans as male and female. It's not talking about anything spiritual or even celestial at that point. But from the beginning would still include the period of time in which humans were made. So the beginning is not just one point, but it is a period of time specific and explicitly having to do with the physical creations of the heavens, the earth, and humans too. So when we get to John 1:1, remember I said it was pretty much the same in the opening part in the Greek text of Genesis 1, NRK, and John 1:1, NRK. Okay, so John, in using that expression, either chose to use what would had to have been, right? the opening and likely first words known from the biblical text of the Jews at that time in terms of their learning, unless they started with the law, right? But either way, one of the most well-known and likely referenced texts and read texts in the beginning, John starts out his narrative with those words. Now, in Genesis 1:1, it describes God. It refers to God in the Hebrew text and in the Greek text. In the Hebrew text, it refers to him as Elohim, and in the Greek text, it refers to him as Hotheos, using the Greek article, the, with God, which at times can make a very specific reference, but it isn't always necessary in order to make one, either in Hebrew or in Greek. But it can be. And so in this case, in Genesis 1:1, the Greek text is the exact same opening words as John 1:1, NRK. And in John 1:1, as most of us know, it goes on to describe how in the beginning that John is describing, a being called the Word or Logos existed. And that Logos was with the God. What would be the equivalent grammatically of Hotheos in the Genesis 1:1 text. So John uses those exact same words, opens his gospel narrative, describes this being as the Word existing with the God who was in the beginning making the heavens and the earth. And then John goes on to describe how this Word was the one through whom God did the things described in Genesis 1. The very context John is borrowing from with the opening of his word, use of his opening words. And he goes on to describe some of the punctuation in verse 3 is disputed in terms of how to translate it, but it doesn't change anything because the context is the same. The context is Genesis 1:1, where God existed in the beginning, NRK, Hotheos. The Word was also there, which would not have been unusual at all for John or his audience, because just as they would have been familiar with Genesis 1:1, not as 1:1, they didn't number it that way, but the words, they knew verses 26, 27, 28, the rest of the text, which describes the creation and God saying, "Let us make man in our image." Using the plural reference, but God is speaking and he's talking to others. Now, biblical texts describe God existing in the beginning, not just with the Word like John goes on to describe, but with other sons of God. Job 38:7 states, you can look it up on your own, that all the sons of God were shouting in applause when God was making the physical creations. And so that is consistent with what we read in Genesis 1 about God speaking to others and making physical things, including us, and what John describes as being the case with regard to the Son of God, the one who John goes on to describe as a being who came to take on flesh as a man and explain the God no one has seen at any time. He, that is the Word who became a man and who was a God with God in the beginning, like the other sons of God, that God, that Son of God, is called the only begotten God. Monogenes theos. The God he's with in the beginning is never, ever called monogenes or monogenes theos. So it's not possible for them to be the same God. because the Word that's with God in the beginning is not only distinct from him as it being with him, but he's also a different theos. Not only distinctly in terms of his existence with him in the beginning, right? In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was a God. There's distinction there. He's described as a different kind of God, as an only begotten God, as the one who can perfectly explain him, just like he told his followers he was doing to them the whole time. John 14, or rather the Father was doing through him, and he was complying with it, just like he did in creation, according to these texts, because it says that God created through the Word, that the Word was actually an only begotten God. And in other texts like Colossians 1, it calls him the firstborn, not in a figurative sense, like the one or two times. Firstborn is used figuratively. Firstborn is almost always used in a literal sense, and when it's used of actual people in a filial context, it is actually literal. It's defined for us in Deuteronomy 21:17 as the beginning of one's generative power, which is why Jesus is called the monogenes, the only generated, only begotten, uniquely begotten God. He's the beginning of God's generative power. He's the firstborn, not figuratively. He's not God who's taking on the title of someone else who's really God's first creation. And first creation, protoktistos, which some believe Paul would have used in Colossians 1:15 if he meant first created, isn't really what anyone is talking about when we talk about birth. Do you refer to your child as your creation, or as your begotten, your born, your firstborn if they're born? First creation or firstborn? We always call them firstborn, even if we mean by that a start to life. So it's nonsense when people say another term would be necessary, especially when that term was not even in use during that time, and when the term used suffices. Not only suffices because of the numerous, overwhelming majority of cases in which it clearly means firstborn. It's actually defined for us. Deuteronomy 21:17. You couldn't get any more assistance from the text than that. And yet people will throw that out, run to a figurative text, and apply it to Jesus as if that's what's meant. That would be like me going to a text like where it refers to God as their belly. Figuratively in the Bible, it refers to people's God as their belly. Well, the next time a Trinitarian brings up John 1:1, you know what I'm going to do? Or if they pull the whole they try to use like a figurative reference for firstborn for a literal reference for firstborn. They do that. I'm going to say, well, you know what? In John 1:1, God there for the word is just figurative. It refers to a figurative reference. He's not really a God there in the sense that the God he's with is there. Why do I know? Well, even your belly is called a God. Even a person's belly is called God. See? It's figurative. You see, that would be the equivalent of what some of these Trinitarian apologetic nuts do when they run away from the tidal wave of evidence that shows it means, your actual firstborn, like we use it, like it's defined in the biblical text. Deuteronomy 21:17. He's called that in literal references without any figurative context. Hebrews 1:6, Colossians 1:15. Nothing figurative at all about those. Yet people will try to apply figurative uses to it. Next time they do that, I'm just going to say John 1:1, theos for the word is figurative. And I'm going to let them prove it's not, right? Because in proving it's not, they'll prove why firstborn is not figurative in Colossians 1 or Hebrews 1. And so I'm just going to then say, okay, exactly. I agree with you now on John 1:1. And that exact same argument you just gave me about why God in John 1:1 C is not figurative is exactly why you should not believe firstborn is figurative in Colossians 1. And there's even more reasons, of course. But that at a minimum, I'm going to make them do. because they're doing that to us in these ridiculous ways, having us try to prove something that's obviously not figurative in any contextual way or reference. They're basically trying to get us to prove it's not when it obviously is. It's almost like a flat earth argument. Either way, they don't ever prove that there's a figurative context, a non-literal application of Jesus as firstborn in Hebrews 1 or Colossians 1. Yet, those two references of him as the firstborn are essentially equivalent to monogenes theos, right? At least in the sense that he's firstborn because he's the beginning of God's generative power, right? That's what firstborn means. Deuteronomy 21:17. Well, generative power is what monogenes means. He's your first. He's your only. He's your only begotten or uniquely begotten. There's a couple of ways that can be used, but it's still begotten. But like with Abraham, it can be applied to someone in a literal sense without having only one child, because of the unique sense in which he and Sarah had Isaac. But that still involved an actual literal only begottenness in that sense. You have to define it though, right? Contextually. And so it can be uniquely born in that way. The same with Jesus. God has other sons, but they're not uniquely born in the sense that he is as the first. Right? There's only one first of one's generative power according to the biblical text. These terms, firstborn, only begotten, are used for us. They're meant to convey to us who use these terms what the relationship is between God and his Son in the divine realm. It couldn't really be any more clear, as I've said many times. We'll run out of terms to use or ways to describe this relationship if we don't accept what's already given. And it's so clear and obvious, from firstborn to only begotten to son to father to child to being given life. How many other ways does it have to be said, right? Beginning of the creation by God. We have a text in Proverbs 8 that I'll go ahead and share with you briefly that states basically the exact same things that we read about in John 1:1, Genesis 1 through 28, involving let us make man in our image, the sons of God, Job 38:7. Let's take a look. Proverbs 8, this is my translation. We're just going to read a few texts. We'll read verses 27 through 31. This starts out in ways that most people don't know, because in verse 12 we get the first person pronoun, which is different from other abstractions like counsel and knowledge, which aren't presented in the same way. And of course, Jesus identifies himself as wisdom in the New Testament. I wrote a whole article about it years ago. I've written about these subjects decades ago. There's really no excuse not to have read some of that material to see why we and so many other early church fathers identify Jesus with wisdom, like he does himself, if you read the text that I quote. So here you get wisdom speaking, and then in verse 21 you get a unique additional reference in the Greek, because in it may represent an older reading than we have in the Masoretic text. And it says, with wisdom speaking, note the parallels here. It's very important, because historically we not only have Jesus identifying himself as wisdom, we have identifications between the two all over the place. And the earliest church fathers identify Jesus as wisdom as well. So, in verse 21, the Septuagint, wisdom says, in order that I might apportion my property to those loving me, and their treasure rooms I will fill with good possessions. If I inform you, this is the very important part you need to remember. If I inform you about what happens each day, I will keep close in mind what things have come forth out of the age of old to number. And then she numbers them. Lord Jehovah created me as the beginning of his activities regarding his works. Here's a note here. It goes into the verb use, form of ektizo, Hebrew kana, goes into the other verbs that are almost always ignored in this discussion, but all of which involve a temporal association and priority. Verses 23, 24, and 25, all the verbs there are used. consistent with this birth, creation imagery, the exact same things that we see in Jesus in the New Testament. This is that article here that I was referencing. So if you go to my blog, Watching the Ministry, October 18th, 2010, and if you just go down to the end, I'm not going to do it all here, but you can do this on your own. You'll get columns here that show parallels between Jesus and the Word, and wisdom in the Word, and a lot of material that I believe shows pretty clearly. These are the same too. And I have more information I'll be including as an updated version of that article in an appendix to my coming translations of Proverbs. But let's just get to a couple last texts. So verse 23, before the original age he made me, as a firm foundation in the beginning. Note the association with Genesis and John. Before he made the earth and before he made the deep places, before the earlier springs of water, before the mountains came to be settled, and before all of the hills, he reproduced or begot me. There's a note there also showing the association and parallels between what Jesus says in John 8:58 and in this text. Verse 26, the Lord made countries and extremely difficult places, the highest locations under heaven for being inhabited. When he made the heavens ready, I was there with him. And when he set apart his own throne over the winds, when he made the clouds above strong. Oh, sorry, let me get the whole text in there. You can follow along as well on the reading below. I had a little blocked out there. Verse 28, when he made the clouds above strong, when he set in place the reliable sources of water under the heavens, when he made the foundation of the earth strong, I was with him, putting things together. I was her at whom he would constantly rejoice, and each day I was joyful in his presence during every period of time, when he was completing the world and when he rejoiced in sons of men. Let us make man in our image. This one was with him, putting things together. Very important to keep that in mind, because now, if we go back to our note and consider that part of it together, let me just bring that up. So, as you know, if you look at the note that I referenced earlier, I'll put it up here so you can kind of see it with me. This is our day text. I just copy it from the note below, the description, and you also get the text information. I didn't go over that in our discussion this morning. I will probably tomorrow, but I wanted to get right into the material, and you have the listing of the text below showing the wealth of information we have supporting Genesis. But back to our note. So I'll increase it a little bit here and see if you can see a little better and still keep it on the screen, but you can read with me. And it says, if in the note, as I referenced earlier, Psalm 102. Okay, so this is quoted in Hebrews 1 and applied to Jesus in the sense that he is not like the creation that fades away. Since his resurrection, he now exists forever and ever. That's actually what it goes on to say. And so, nevertheless, the point I want to focus on here is the fact that the Greek text is a little different than the Hebrew text. It's more messianic in its application. But nevertheless, it wouldn't even need to be, because Jesus is involved in this activity. He is the passive agent through which creation was done. Colossians 1 says it. Colossians 1 says, in him were created. Someone else created. He didn't create himself. How do we know? Because the same one who wrote Colossians 1 wrote 1 Corinthians 8:6, where he says, all things are out of the Father and through the Son. So we know the Son isn't creating in himself. It's the Father who's the source. The Father is the one creating in the Son or through the Son. And then the Son puts things together. Even in this text in Hebrews 1, quoted from Psalm 102 Hebrew, Psalm 102 Greek, It says at the beginning, Lord, you positioned the earth. It doesn't say created. And the heavens are the works of your hands, putting things together. Everything, not just the little things, everything, all things. Ta panta. But he's the firstborn of all creation. The firstborn plus tapanta is creation. He's the firstborn. Through him came tapanta. Together they are all creation. He's the beginning of creation by God. Revelation 3:14. He's in the beginning with God, putting things together that have already been created. Positioning things, even in the application of the text from Psalm 101, 102. It all fits together. Hebrews 1, 2, 3 starts off the texts that are quoted from the Old Testament, including Psalm 102, 101, by stating that it was through the Son God made the things that exist. And the Son is the imprint of God's being. That's firstborn. That's only begotten. Imprint. Come into being as the exact image of another. What is he called in Colossians 1? Image of the invisible God. Who is it no one has seen? God. Who came to explain him? Only begotten God. I don't know how clearer these texts could be. It's actually offensive to me when Trinitarian whack jobs who know better, who have these texts, but who refuse to read them, whether it's the text in context or the definition of terms like in Deuteronomy 21:17, it's a failure on their part to stay within these texts and to feel you have to go outside them to a false application of literal to figurative or figurative to literal, or to creeds and councils that have nothing to do with the language of the texts when read in context, and the way terms like God, God, and gods are actually used by individuals at the heart of the controversy. John 10, Psalm 82. So I'm so happy all of you have joined me for these day texts again. I'm looking forward to getting into this material. It's going to be great. This is just the beginning. Now we're in the beginning. And we're going to move our way forward right to the end again. And we're going to repeat that process over and over for as long as it takes us until our end, to help everybody we can come to a knowledge of Jehovah and the one whom he sent forth as Savior of the world, Jesus, the Son of